show tonight. I'd like to also call attention to all the Art League members that got our first Art League newsletter that was sent out in January. That was prepared by Joanna Cutter and our student representative that we had for last semester, Reagan Grussy. I'd like to welcome any volunteers who'd like to serve on our board. So if you're interested, see me sometime this evening before 9:30. Our next meeting will be Wednesday, May 20th, and that will be at the Rotary River Center. That will begin at 5:30. It's a potluck, and we call it our show and tell. I wish any of the artists in the Art League or anybody that comes to the meeting would bring one or two examples of their artwork, and then we'll have a lot of fun looking at those and hearing about them. We'll have a letter on that later on in the first part of May. I'd like to turn the meeting over at this time to our director of the Wright Museum of Art, who is Michael Howell. Here he is. Okay, Michael.
Oh, just a little correction on that. I'm not the director. I'm curator of art here at the Wright Museum. So on behalf of the art department and the Wright Museum of Art, I'd like to welcome all of you here tonight. I'd like to extend a special welcome to members of the Art League of Beloit, to the members of the faculty and staff from departments throughout the college, but in particular, I would like to extend a welcome to all of the students who are here tonight. That's what these programs are about. Tonight, I am very happy, I'm very proud to have with us a sculptor who I think in many ways is setting various standards for a lot of you students who are pursuing art, both conceptually and historically within the world of sculpture and art. Tonight we have with us Jeanne Silverthorne, who comes to us from New York City, where she produces a lot of sculpture. She teaches at the School of Visual Arts in New York. Jeanne has shown extensively in this country. I won't even go through the list of exhibitions that Jeanne has been involved in. I think I'll let Jeanne do a lot of the talking tonight because aside from doing incredible sculptural works, Jeanne truly has a gift for the English language. Jeanne has written extensively for numerous publications across the country and over in Europe. She has been published in Art in America, New York Times, Art Press, the New Art Examiner. I could go on. But in a moment, I'm going to turn this over to Jeanne and let her carry the rest of the night. A brief note, tonight's lecture and program, as well as the small exhibition of Jeanne's work, which is downstairs, and a very large exhibition that will be coming to us in the fall, is sponsored by Stuart Ginsburg, one of our trustees here at the college, who believes very strongly in the power of art to help us and to guide us into the next century. Stuart has a lot of faith in the art department here, and this is just the start of some of the programs that we're going to be developing here in the art department and in the Wright Museum. A special thanks to Joe Hortel, art historian with the art department here, for spearheading tonight's lecture, and a special thanks to her for introducing me to Jeanne Silverthorne and Jeanne's work. So, without further ado, I'd like to present Jeanne Silverthorne.
Thank you for that introduction, Michael. I can't possibly live up to it. So I'll just get started if that's okay. We need to lower the lights. Thank you all for coming. I know most, if not all of you, have had lots of interesting invitations this evening. So thanks for coming here. What I'd like to do essentially is take you through 4 of the most recent installations that I've done. Just take you through a tour of each of those spaces. However, I can never do things quite that simply, so I have a series of prefaces before we get there. So 3 prefaces in which I'll show you some earlier work and hope to kind of explain to you how I got to the place where I am now, how I came to be making the things I'm making now. And I'm starting with this piece, which is from about 1986 or 1987, because for a number of reasons. One is it's one of the first pieces that I made in rubber, which is a material that I've continued to use almost exclusively, certainly consistently, ever since then. Another reason why I'm starting with this is because it already engages a lot of images and references that have been consistent since then. The sort of attraction to electrical devices, lighting devices, and the use of cartoon imagery, although, a kind of, if you will, a minor note in the work is also fairly consistent, although it doesn't seem quite so obvious in the slides I'm going to show you. I take my word for it that it crops up over and over again. And I'm also starting with this piece because it marked the beginning of a whole new body of work and the end of another one. And here I'm going to ask you to imagine some pieces. I don't want to take you too far back into the dark ages of my work. You have enough to look at tonight. But if you can imagine, before this point, I had been making sculptures that were very much about the connection between body and language. And they were essentially images, 3-dimensional images, of body parts, usually in prosthetic devices of some kind. And they were coupled with graven words, engraved words, usually very simple words like to, or so-so, or frankly, or says. So for instance, there might be a kind of an image of a knee brace and the word to underneath it on this elaborate base, or the image of a leg brace, an empty leg brace, and the word says on the base. And it went on like half a denture on a kind of podium, and the word so-so. And what I was interested in at that point was the relationship between what was getting a kind of objective correlative for what it felt like to be on the receiving end of language, what the sort of physical, visceral impact of words was. And mainly I saw this, I had a sort of paranoid and childlike view of language, the simple notion that words hurt was what I was kind of after. But it wasn't long before this one-to-one correspondence of prosthetic device and word began to be a little boring. Maybe I should mention why I was putting these things in prosthetic devices. I had this notion that language, although this is probably only a fantasy, we have a fantasy that language is somehow substituted, it's secondary in some ways. We always say, oh, the words can't really express, or the words somehow are suggesting that that they're not the first response in some way, that something is missing. And so I thought that language was a little bit like a prosthetic device in that it's an aid, like prosthetic devices are meant to be supports and aids. But there's the fantasy or the sense that they indicate that something has gone missing, something has been damaged. There's something, as I said, substitutive or secondary about it. In fantasy, anyway, if not in reality, this may not be the case. So that's what that was partly about. But I got sort of tired, as I said, of picking these body parts or prosthetic devices and attaching these words to them. And I began to look for more sort of, I should say, less obvious manifestations of the body, like tears or breath. Or at one point, I was making images of DNA, which is itself a kind of language. I finally thought I wanted to sort of, somehow give a body to thought. What does a thought look like? I mean, that's a part of the body, if you will, but not so obvious. And so here you have basically a pile of thoughts, because cartoons have already given us an image of what a thought looks like. It's the light bulb that goes on over your head, of course. So here you have a pile of thoughts having an idea about themselves. Or if you will, you have light bulbs, speaking light bulbese. So in one sense, it marked kind of, I won't say the end of language in the work, because as you'll see, language pops up in a different way. But it in many ways, the pieces got more mute, I think, after this. And, you know, in the 80s, one of the hot issues in contemporary art was revolved around language. And one of those questions being whether there was anything outside of language. There's that whole issue of how do I know what I think till I hear what I say? Can you have a thought without having words? All those issues. When, you know, the debate over this was raging and I was sort of interested in it, and finally, I guess I had come to agree with Richard Rorty, who sort of decided that the idea of whether there's anything outside language or not is sort of like the 18th century debate over the existence of God. It's not that we can prove it one way or the other, it's that, you know, we just got tired of talking about it. And I think this piece was a little bit about that. I don't know, body, language, hurtful, not, I don't know. Here, this is kind of tautology. There's a bunch of ideas, and what I was saying, well, they're having an idea. So in some ways, it's about a kind of circularity, and in other ways, it still establishes a certain difference because there's the pile of light bulbs versus one light bulb. There's a three-dimensional image versus a linear image. So I guess I was trying to have my cake and eat it too, and still, you know, give up all at the same time. At any rate, as I said, it did sort of mark the beginning of something. And here's that same piece in its, if you will, in its proper arrangement with a bunch of other light bulbs, pairs of spotlights, and a single light bulb over to the right, just broken open. And I'm showing you this slide because this too is something that has been consistent. Really, I started dealing with this issue of arrangement and syntax and how meaning can arise out of what you put next to something. If you have an object, just as you have a word in isolation, that's one thing. You put another word or object beside it, you have a different meaning. If you change the order of those words or objects, you might have an even different meaning. And that's very much in line with what we know about how meaning operates, which is that it's not a sort of spice that you put into a cake that you can then, if you're enough of a gourmet, taste and get back out of the cake. Rather, meaning is something that's ongoing, it's a process, it's constantly being constructed, and not by one person, say the artist, but by numerous people over time in different contexts. And so the meaning is constantly changing in relation to those things. So the idea that meaning is slippery and always on the move has been of interest to me. And so I constantly recombine things, take things apart, and put them together with other pieces, use them again, multiply them. And so this is, you know, an example of that, basically. Here's another idea about what an idea looked like. This is my notion of what a thought might be. This is a thought cloud. It's one thought. And if you're wondering how I ever got to that image, I was taking, again, this cartoon speech bubble, which someone told me is called a phylactery. I have no idea if that's accurate or not, but I've been spreading this around for years. A phylactery. And combining it with all those clouds that Bernini's saints stand on. I don't know if you ever looked at them, but they're quite wonderful textural in terms of their mass and coiling shapes. So I combined those together, those two forms. So, but this is about the size of a cauliflower, something that you would be able to hold in your hand, or cantaloupe. And that's one thought. And there are two thoughts. And what was fun about this was that I used the same mold. Basically, the technique I use is the ancient technique of making things out of clay, and then making a mold, and then taking the clay out of the mold and filling the mold with, in this case, rubber. So I used the same mold, plaster mold, to cast both of these, but in the one on the left, I filled inside the rubber with wax, and the one on the right was filled with expanding foam. So the one on the left is thin but heavy, and the one on the right is thicker but quite light. So you have a heavy thought and a light thought. And again, I like the way things sort of always have their own kind of irony. They stand themselves on end and surprise you. So it was very fun for me that something that, you know, I thought it was coming out of one end of the body, thought really looked a lot more like something that comes out of the other end of the body. And I think this is the last slide in the first preface. I actually talk less, believe it or not, as the slides go on, but it takes a while. So. I'm missing missing a slide because I forgot to ask Michael backwards the slide of the speech. But at any rate, had you seen that slide, and any of you have seen the piece downstairs, which was a stack of books with, again, another cartoon sort of speech bubble on top of an Z, or like a pile of sleeping books. This candlestick, it's a bent rubber candlestick, and the two rubber books were originally part of that arrangement. At a certain point, I took them out of that arrangement and put them into this one, and combine them with this frame piece that you see there. And I include this slide in the preface just to bring up this, again, to emphasize the sort of recombinatory aspect of all this, but also to point out that that little frame piece is a small, what I call skin painting. If you could look at it in real life or touch it, you would see it has a kind of sort of skin texture, like an alligator kind of texture to it. And although this is not the first skin piece I made, these frame skin paintings are something I've become more and more sort of obsessed with, and I'm still making them. They've gotten a lot more elaborate, and they've gone under the skin now for sort of microscopic views of hair follicles and sweat glands and things like that. But that's something that was in the work very early on also. So I think that's the end of the first preface, yeah. All of this was happening, as I said, in the late 80s. In about 1990, I was going to lose my studio. Not for the first time. I'd had numerous studios. But for some reason, I was particularly stricken this time by the thought of leaving, because I wasn't sure I'd have enough money to get another space. I was living in Manhattan, and I knew how expensive things were, and I don't know, for some reason, I was particularly upset at the thought of leaving, and very worried that I might not find another space. And I lived in an apartment in New York, which is fine to live in, but much too small to work in. And it already has my husband in it, so I couldn't be bringing all this stuff into it. So I started to be sort of obsessed about the studio space itself. And I hadn't, meanwhile, left this space that I was going to have to leave. I knew that was imminent, but I hadn't left yet. So I started sort of walking around, just, you know, kind of abstractedly picking up little pieces of debris off the studio floor, little pieces of plaster that had dripped off plaster molds, little tiny pieces of rubber that were left over from pouring things. And these are generally about the size of a fingernail. And I started putting them in these little boxes, thinking, well, I could at least take these with me. And I'd have these sort of souvenirs of the studio. And at first, I didn't know what I would do with them. And then I hit on the idea that I could enlarge them. I could start copying them and enlarging them, and still keep it all on a fairly small scale. But it would be a way of sort of, you know, if I were forced to work in my apartment in some tiny little corner, you know, just maybe I might be able to make things like this. So what you're looking at here in front of the photographs are the earliest of these enlargements of these little tiny scraps. And they're not, as you can see, they're not very large. I think the largest of these is not even a foot tall. So, you know, I was thinking of them small. And they're literally copied. I would look at these little scraps through a magnifying glass and copy them in clay as best I could. And the only thing I was adding at this point were the bases, the sort of square and cylindrical bases that you see. Everything else was as exact a copy of these scraps as I could make them. Well, having done only a few of these, I realized they were looking sort of already familiar, like I'd seen them before somewhere. And of course, what I was doing was picking up scraps that already looked like art. But I was picking up things that looked particularly like a certain kind, a certain period of art, like turn-of-the-century Beaux-Art kinds of things. And you know, what with that notion in my head and looking around at the space I was in so intensely, which was itself a 19th century space, kind of old industrial building. Most artists' studios in New York and other parts of the country, I think, are in these sort of antiquated buildings. And you know, facing the prospect of, you know, getting up the money for this move and getting money to pay more rent and, you know, and thinking of, you know, just the 100-pound bags of plaster you have to buy and the barrels of clay and all the stuff that's involved in it. A sense of what a kind of absurd and in some ways antiquated notion this being in a studio in an atelier situation 20th century was. And, you know, having made these things that looked like they were from the turn of the century too, made me think about this. So, again, looking around the studio that I was about to leave, I thought, well, gee, you know, maybe I should start taking photographs of this place. Photography being, in some respects, I think, a kind of memorializing practice. It's certainly a documentary practice. And so everything started to have this aura of the past to it, if you will. And so I decided to take the photographs in black and white and to make them sort of deliberately nostalgic, which wasn't hard because the space was already a 19th century space. Before I get too far ahead of myself, however, I should show you some more of these enlargements before I carry on with the story. There's another one. This was a tiny little scrap of plaster, fell off some mold. And again, the only thing that was added was the base. Now, at a certain point, all of these pieces got that black base. That black base is rubber. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But eventually, they all ended up with these rubber bases as well. There's another one. That, too, eventually had a rubber base. This was the largest of the pieces. Again, it's maybe a little over a foot. This was this twist of rubber, dried up rubber, that I copied. Here's a piece in its clay state before I cast it. By the way, the material that these pieces I'm showing you was cast in is something called hydrocal, which is essentially like dental plaster. And I put some green pigment in the water before I put the plaster in. This was actually not a piece of debris picked up off the floor, but when you buy these jars of latex rubber, which I was using to cast the rubber pieces, and it starts to dry out, you can lift the lid off, and the drips under the lid form something like this. So if you can imagine that base as the top of the lid, the underneath side of the lid, and this thing is inverted, that's what it looked like. And I just sort of flipped it over and copied it in clay. And then eventually this was cast in the green hydrocal as well. There's another one that was a little chip of plaster. And these are the photographs which I started taking. And you can see for yourself how nostalgic they were. How nostalgic the space was. There's a mold put back together after I'd taken the piece out. So, you know, it hadn't done too many of these photographs and these enlargements before I realized I had a little sort of mini museum going here. You know, if you were to go to the Rodin Museum, for instance, in Paris, what do you see there? You see studies of work that he's done, you see photographs, and you see correspondence, you see letters. And, oh, letters, yes, now that's something I can do without a studio. I can write. And so I started also to write these letters and to sort of invent this fictional, this persona who inhabited this studio, time and place unknown, who was always desperate, in fact, you might even say quite mad, and who would write these hysterical letters addressed to Mama. And I have to say that, well, before I say it, I'll go on with it. This one says, there are hints I may have to defend these letters to you, Mama, 30 days, 30 coats of L200. L200 is the name of the rubber that I use. And the stamp that you see at the bottom is one of the statuettes at the bottom of one of those. In other words, those rubber pads that they all sit on are actually stamps. So the idea was that each of the letters could be stamped with one or more of the sculptures. And the whole thing then would become a kind of echo chamber, kind of recycling. Obviously, this was a moment when I really thought I had to use everything up. And, you know, I might not have a studio again. How can I make everything work, every scrap count? How can I make everything tie in with everything else? So, you know, I was getting very obsessed with that. The reason I addressed the letters to Mama is this. Having made these sculptures, which look so much like, you know, sort of cheap knockoffs of Rodin. I don't mean they look that good. I just mean that they had that kind of reference point. And having made these photographs, which were so much about that period, I realized that in some ways the sculptures were a kind of nostalgia about the tradition of the father. Certainly if I had been a woman making art at the turn of the century, I'd have been lucky to have been Camille Claudel. And she was, as we know, not so lucky. There would have been no place for me in that tradition. Whereas the epistolary tradition was a tradition that was very much open to women. In fact, it was and if you will, that might have been called the tradition of the mother. And that's why I addressed the letters to Mama. Also, I was interested in a kind of hysteria of nostalgia. I mean, here I was thinking that this whole process of making things by hand in an isolated condition, this sort of crazy, mad notion of locking yourself up in a garret to make works by hand at the end of the 20th century, when we're all trying to get out of our bodies via the computer. All of this just seemed to me, the whole practice of what I was involved in, what I committed myself to, seemed so archaic and so nostalgic that I wanted to address that. And so I had on the one hand the tradition of the father, which was hopelessly nostalgic and unavailable because it was so past. And in the letters I had the tradition of the mother, which was also hopelessly nostalgic and unavailable. However, having said that, I wanted to sort of have a kind of hysteria of sentimentality, kind of excessiveness, because excessiveness can trouble the rules. I grew so uncomfortable with the address to Mama that I subsequently went back and crossed out Mama, and now they're all addressed to N. But now you all know what that N stands for. I wanted them to be just a touch more mysterious, a little bit cooler. So actually they've changed since this. At any rate, all of this sort of goes on, this series. I'm ashamed to live outside the studio. They should expel me. There's the faint image of one that stands in the corner. I continued to write these letters. This one's, whoever is speaking here, this woman has really lost it here. And this letter makes absolutely no sense. With sudden abruption, the morality of mankind is lost and cannot be reversed. Mankind is on the verge of depletion. Of course, realistically, such is impossible. The Sphinx is symbolically perturbed. It is all a selfish movement. Thus we see the birth of innate greed. Be careful, Mama. Do not take the Sphinx literally. And then just these sort of short, dismissive, despairing comments. Anyway, these letters and the photographs, I continue to write and take. And I continue this practice of enlarging pieces of debris, although, as you see, now I cast them in rubber, and the scale is larger, and that's changing something. That, I think, is the end of the second preface, yes. And in our third and final preface, before we even get to the installations, I got another studio, big surprise. Everybody in the world would know that except me. But it was like the other one in the sense that, again, it was this 19th century building in better shape than the one I've been in, but still a similar sort of building. And by now I was so sort of hyper-aware of, if you will, the anachronistic quality of what I was doing, that I couldn't get it out of my head. And wanted somehow to be able to acknowledge that sense of being a kind of dinosaur, if you will, and yet still continue. I mean, this is something I love doing. And, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I got to keep doing this. I wanted to keep doing it. So I wanted some way to, as I said, to keep doing it, but acknowledge, what a small space was left to work in. And so I was thinking about the studio space, the studio practice, and this very romantic, essentially pre-20th century notion of the isolated artist working alone, making things by hand. And so I thought it might be possible to treat the studio space as a kind of archaeological site, that you might excavate it. If it's a dead site, what can you do with it? Well, you can dig it up and you can inventory the contents. Or if you will, I've always seen spaces as like bodies, and I have a tendency to anthropomorphize things anyway, as you can probably tell. So when I started sort of excavating the guts of the space, here what you're looking at is a series of electrical wires and electrical devices in rubber. On the floor there are fuse boxes and switches and plugs, and some of them on the wall as well, and they're draped over two cast hydrocal faucets. So it was sort of as if the guts of the space had kind of spit themselves up. So I do think of spaces as being like bodies, and their infrastructures being, I started taking the space apart, and there's one of the first instances of that. Here's another one. And here, and by the way, both these pieces, again, are made up of other pieces that I've taken apart and recombined. Here you have essentially a disaster scene. It's as if the ceiling has fallen in, and the pipe has broken, and the whole thing is frozen over. There's an air vent, there are more fuse boxes, wiring, etc. All of them on this modernist rebuilt table, and then there are some rubber frames on the floor. The rebuilt table was from another piece, but I like the idea of taking this icon of modernism. Rebuilt was one of the style group members, and this table is one of the pieces of furniture he designed. Only he designed it in wood and he painted it in primary colors, and he certainly never had wheels on it. So I remade it in hydrocal and I put the wheels on it. But I liked having this icon of modernism in the scene of chaos and entropy, if you will. And then I started thinking about the products of the studio. The studio itself is both metaphysically and, in my case, literally falling apart. What about the things that are made in the studio? And I have been trained as a painter, and I have a great love of the icon of the painting, the rectangle on the wall. I always think there should be one. And so I started making a series of paintings that would come out of the studio, and they themselves are also, in some way, inaccessible. Here's painting number 1, which is cracked and frozen over. It's a sort of icicle in the corner, and it's accompanied by an empty rubber light bulb, and there's no bulb, light fixture, which is all rubber, including the chain, but there's no bulb in it. It's sort of my homage to Philip Guston. This is painting number 2. Again, it's all rubber, but what it is an image of a painting all wrapped up in bubble wrap with its protective cardboard corners. So you can't see it. It's inaccessible too, and it's accompanied by sort of fallen and inefficient spotlight. And painting number 3, you can quite see the tail end of it, but it's a painting in which there's nothing happening in the painting. Everything is happening either above or below. It's as though all the surface incident has either evaporated into the cloud up above or been evacuated through the tube below, which you can't quite see. This slide has a little bit of stuff kind of oozing out of the bottom. So that, I think that's the end of the preface then. We can actually get on to, oh no, it's not, sorry. I continued the practice of picking up these little pieces of debris off the floor and enlarging them, but I made the decision to cast them in rubber, and oddly enough, that had a strange influence on my choice of shapes. Whereas before I'd been picking pieces of debris, there was some plastic, more sort of angular and fragmented looking in their edges. Once I knew I was going to cast in rubber, something about the kind of skin-like, fluid nature of rubber that made me pick more kind of biomorphic shapes to begin with. So this was a little piece of styrofoam that I found on the floor, and all I added was the base. And it's accompanied by a rubber light, of course. And this was a little piece of plaster, and all I did was add the rubber base. But what I thought was really interesting was, again, this nice irony where the works had a good laugh at my expense. Here I was going on talking about the deadness of the studio and the corpse of the studio. And suddenly, the studio seemed to be producing these little microorganisms, these little biomorphic things that seem very much about teeming life rather than death. So I thought that was kind of neat. And that really is, I think, the end of the premises. Okay. Now, I'm just going to take you through these 4 fairly recent installations. And I think these will go a little bit more quickly. This first one, first installation I'll show you is from about maybe 3 years ago, I forget, 2 or 3 years ago. It was at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. And it consisted of 2 rooms. This is the view as you came in the first room. And many of the same issues that I've been talking to you about concerning the studio were at work here. And also at the beginning, some concerns with transition from studio space to exhibition space. And a new opportunity to connect things via the wiring systems that had begun to emerge by looking at what was in the studio. And also in the studio, in these old buildings, the wiring systems are like genealogies. Because they're kind of palimpsests, they don't put things behind the wall, they just slap the newer wiring system on top of the old. And so you never know what's working, what's not working, but if space right there. So I always thought that was kind of nice. Anyway, when you walk in the first room, this is what you saw. And the wire that you see on the floor there, coming and leading to the back, actually leads you through all of the spaces. It leads you off to the right around the corner. It leads you back to the back wall. It leads you off to the left into the next room. It takes you around the half wall there. So it becomes like a kind of thread or Ariadne's thread that leads you through the labyrinth. Or if you will, it becomes like a narrative line that can take you through the space. And this was really one of the first times I was able to do that. On this sort of work table here is another one of those scraps that's been enlarged. And above it, if you sort of look, it kind of blends into the ceiling, is a false fluorescent light. It's cast in a resin. It's not a real light. But it has its own wiring system that goes up to the ceiling and ends in a sort of electrical outlet up there in the ceiling. The light and the work base were actually inspired by, I didn't realize this till long afterwards, my father's workshop, which he had in the basement of our house. And I'll say more about that later, about the sort of autobiographical elements. But without my knowing it, at a certain point, some notion of, between working in 19th century industrial buildings that had been sweatshops and spending a lot of time as a kid in my father's workshop, somehow, for me, working, making stuff with my hands, making sculpture, has been saturated with a kind of blue-collar notion of work, of sweat, and labor. And I've only recently become aware of how much that's the case. But the first inkling of it was when I realized this was the work table, a copy of the work table in my father's workshop, and the exact light, replica of the exact light that he had over it. I should also mention he always did my wiring whenever I needed any wiring. Anyway, turning around in the space to the left of that piece are these two pieces on the wall, close up here. And here are some of those books. Here are some of those skin pieces I was talking about. And although the earlier skin pieces I did just by sort of looking at my own skin and copying parts of it in clay, at a certain point, obviously there's only so much you can copy. I took to looking at reproductions in medical books of microscopic views of various skin sites and skin conditions. So what you're seeing here are copies in clay, at first in clay, then cast in rubber, of enlargements of microscopic views of various skin conditions. One of these is called ephemeral, the other is called dysarthrotic dermatitis. They're rubber, and so are the nails that they hang from. Those are rubber, and so is the cord that it hangs from. It's all rubber. And turning around, looking back sort of at the way it came in, off in the corner, what you see is this. A bunch of pedestals stuck into the corner. Again, the kind of thing you would do in a studio if you had something, just stick it in the corner. A spill of empty rubber frames on the floor, and two enlargements of scraps again. This was a little twist of rubber, and probably not even an inch high originally. And this was a little splat of plaster, which I managed to keep. Usually by the time I finish looking at these, they're so battered they practically fall apart. But this one, I managed to keep the original plaster scrap, and you'll see it pops up later on. So the pedestals were in some way, as I say, about trying to make this transition from studio to exhibition. And keeping them in the corner was a way of keeping that transitional sense going. Off to the right, you see 3 rubber dimmer switches, and a set of dual rubber spotlights. And hanging between them is this rubber painting of my studio floor. And it was literally, this is one of the pieces where I didn't make it out of clay. I literally took some latex, poured it on the floor, pulled it up, put a frame around it, and then made a mold of that. So my hand was not involved in any of this, except in painting the different colored rubbers into the mold. And what I liked about that was, again, one of these nice ironies. When it came out, it looked like a cartoon. Instead of looking real, it should have looked more real than anything, but it looked like a cartoon. And I thought that was funny for a number of reasons. First of all, I do tend to think of the of the traditional studio, the kind of studio I'm engaged in and occupy, as being a bit of a cartoon in its absurdity at this point in time. And also what I was doing was literally transferring the studio to exhibition spaces, that is copying parts of the studio and turning them into work that could be shown. And in some ways that's the original meaning of the cartoons, a kind of transfer device from drawing to painting, a way of mapping one thing to another. So, you know, it's funny the way things happen and they sort of tell you what's going on rather than the other way around. And this was one of many images of the studio floor I made, and these were not in the exhibition I'm taking you through, but here are a few more examples. Again, a literal impression of the studio floor. This was a paint can rim, you know, left on the floor after you take the paint can up. And the only thing I did was add the colors. These are rubber all. Again, these were taken from, this was a mold on the floor, a bunch of plaster drips that had fallen on the floor. But when you finish with it, it looks like sort of Woolworth's landscape, you know, generic abstraction, generic landscape. It's easy to make art. It's your generic biomorphism, but it was originally a plaster lump on my studio floor. Anyway, back to the exhibition. Going around the corner, so if you follow that line of dimmer switches and spotlights that hover over the studio floor painting around the corner, that collection of wires ends in these rubber fuse boxes and rubber tubings. And in this particular space, the ICA, there was a ramp. You're looking at it as the beginning of a ramp that led down to the next level. And on one side was this railing, as you can see. On the other side of the ramp, which was, I don't know, maybe 3 feet wide, was a half wall, so that if you were standing there, you could look over the half wall all the way down to the next level. So the wiring went across the ramp, up over the half wall, and all the way down to the next level, where it ended in a rubber outlet at the first ground floor level. So, you know, it was very greedy and got to use, you know, as many spaces as possible. Coming back around from there, more wiring. And opposite the wiring are 3 more skin pieces. Again, all in rubber. One is called Axilla of a Caucasian Woman. And if, like me, you don't know what an axilla is, it means underarm. So, the second one is wrist burn, and I copied that literally from the wrist of my burn. I am not the wrist of my burn. A burn of my wrist, which I enlarged. And the last one is classical follicular papules. Again, microscopic view of something or other. More rubber nails, more rubber cords. And I'll say something in a minute about how the skin pieces relate to this notion of the studio, which is probably puzzling you if you're thinking about it at all. Back out from there's the collection of fuse boxes and electrical cords that was on the rear wall as you came into the space. And following that cord along the floor, back out, you know, almost into the second room. In that recess there is the first skin painting, or one of the first so-called skin paintings I made. Here's the actual first one. This is a bad slide, but not as bad as it looks, because what happened is I made this piece originally, and they're made out of latex, these early pieces. And latex is a natural rubber. And the black part has a kind of, has black acrylic paint in it. But the sort of picture card, if you will, what's inside the frame in these very first pieces was just pure latex. And I hadn't had enough experience with latex to know about its properties and what would happen to it. And I went off for a week, having left this piece on a table near the window. When I came back, it was sunburned. As you see, it turned red. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I got hooked on skin paintings. Because it really is, I mean, latex anyway really is like skin in many ways. And the fact that it gets affected by the sun is only one of those. And in terms of, you know, how these things relate to the studio, I mean, I think in some ways, as I said, I think of the studio as a kind of body. And so if the wiring and plumbing are the intestines and guts of that particular body, then the floors and the walls and the ceiling are its sort of skin, if you will. And also, I think there's a sense when you spend a lot of time in a space of intense and long occupation, you certainly feel that you're projecting yourself on the space all the time, and that the space becomes deformed, if you will, by your projection. perceptions of it. And that's a very common perception. Children do that all the time to spaces. But I think there's also a sense in which it's reciprocal, and the space begins to imprint itself on you. And I guess what I'm thinking of is, with a sort of, if you will, the scientific proof I have for this, it's of course not proof at all, is that I was reading this book called The Making of Memory by Stephen Rose, in which he describes an experiment he conducted on some baby chicks. He taught some baby chicks these tasks to pick up these beads. And after teaching them the tasks, he dissected their portal brains. And he discovered that after learning the tasks, don't ask me how he knew before or after, but at any rate, after learning the tasks, the physical structure of their brains had changed. The axons and dendrites had become thicker, more numerous, and rearranged themselves. And I thought, well, if you're in a space for a very long time, certainly you've learned that space. And so, theoretically at least, it must have deformed your body on some level. At any rate, that's pretty fancy footwork. But I certainly know that you're all familiar with the sense of having, like, been in a room so long, you feel like your skin is on the walls. You just feel stretched out over that space. So in some ways, that's partly what this is about. And also framing the skin. I mean, if taking the space apart and treating it like a body is a way of making architecture organic, then taking the skin and putting a frame around it is a way of making the organic architectural. So there's that kind of a circularity going on with that. Anyway, this is the second room in this first installation I'm showing you. And you'll recognize on the right painting number 3, which I've already showed you. And way back in the corner there's another skin piece. It's an image of my knuckle elongated, which has a scar on it, also in rubber. Back behind that half wall is a piece which is actually the end of the wire piece, which was in the first room. But obviously what's taking up most of the sort of space in the room is this rubber chandelier, which I'll show you here. I made the chandelier out of clay, and then I cast it in, actually it's fiberglass and rubber. And coming off the chandelier are all these wires and cords which hook up to a black rubber cast of an emergency exit sign. Above the real exit sign there, I know it's not very visible on the slide, is one of those exit signs with battery-operated spotlights on it, which you see in most spaces, something like there. And it's the kind of thing that's supposed to come on when the lights go out, because when the electrical system fails, this is the emergency backup lighting system. And of course, in this case, nothing works. It's all black and dysfunctional. And again, you're probably wondering what a chandelier has to do with this discourse about the studio. And on one level, it has nothing to do with it whatsoever. I just wanted to make this thing. I've been making all these electrical devices, light bulbs and fixtures. And I wanted something that would, where I could indulge my desire to make decorative shapes. I wanted something that would be hanging rather than on a wall or on the floor. I wanted something large, dramatic. And as I said, for me, these wires and electrical systems were about the body. And for me, this image of the chandelier was like a big severed head. I don't expect anybody else to have this reaction to it, but that's what was going on in my head. It was like a sort of Medusa head hanging in space. But once I was sort of started on the project of this, and I was thinking about it, and I realized that there were more associations for me, mainly about notions of enlightenment. And the chandelier is giving off light. It's this big dramatic burst of light. But of course, chandeliers are themselves archaic and out of date, pre-modern, if you will, lighting devices. And thinking about the Enlightenment and the principles of the Enlightenment in relation to that, thinking about how all of those notions that the truth will make us free, that progress is inevitable, the rational is good, all those principles of the Enlightenment which comes to us from the 18th century are still so much in effect. They take up all this sort of space in the house of culture, if you will, but they're not working. I mean, we know they haven't worked. If they were working, we'd be in far better shape than we are. But we don't have anything to replace them either. So they're still like this big dead chandelier hanging in the house of culture, taking up all the iconic space, taking up all our attention, but not quite functional, not even thinking about this chandelier and its, its sort of associations with enlightenment being like the artist in the studio, both sort of taking up all the space in these defunct spaces. And in fact, the whole notion of the studio that we have, of this lone, usually male genius toiling away, making masterpieces in an attempt to liberate himself and get at the truth, is a product of the Enlightenment. This was not a notion that was in effect before then. So, I mean, there are connections, albeit, I didn't start out with all these connections. I think that there is some way to make this all hang together if you need that to happen. Anyway, if you follow these wires around behind the half wall, as we're doing in these slides, you see this, which is, again, an empty light socket, rubber light socket, and various electrical cords, and on the wall, one of those little letters. I think it's the one about being expelled from the studio. Some letter that expresses despair at losing a place in the studio. And coming around, this is back out. This is the tangle of wires that leads the chandelier. Then coming to the end of this installation, on that wall there is a diptych. And on the left-hand side is this piece. And this is called young collagen. And collagen, as I'm sure many of you know, is the structure under our skin. And Vogue magazine is very worried about it. We're not taking good care of it. And, but this is what young collagen looks like. And this is what sun-damaged collagen looks like. And I thought sun-damaged collagen was much more interesting than so I gave it a better frame. And then the last piece in the show, if you're making this sort of tour through it, is this. And on the walls, another skin piece is called skin pathology. And again, it's a blow-up of some microscopic view of some pathology of the skin. In a different kind of rubber, this is in a more industrial rubber, not latex. It's surmounted by a silicone rubber museum light, which is losing its shape, flopping down. And it's being contemplated by one of those fragments, pieces of debris that I enlarged from the studio, which has its own little thought bubble of puzzlement coming out, and it sits on a hydrocal sort of sculpture base. And that was the end of that installation. This next installation I'm going to take you through is just from last year, February of last year. It was a somewhat different space in New York at an uptown gallery. A very beautiful gallery, but a very sort of classic gallery. Very clean, and very much the white cube, which is itself by now a slightly out-of-date notion as well. And I tried to address that a little bit too. But at any rate, this too was an installation that was connected by wiring, as I'll show you in a moment. But when you were at the front door, before you sort of got into the space, what you could see was again a sort of pair of rubber paintings. This was one of them. This is called sweat glands, I think. I mean, it's sweat glands or sweat ducts or whatever. At one magnification with rubber nail and rubber cord. That's a close-up view of the sweat glands. And this is sweat glands at a higher magnification. And they were side by side on the wall as we sort of came in. And it's a close-up of the higher magnification. And then as you turned, you got into the space and you turned, this was like the left hand of the gallery that you could see. And again, there are rubber dimmer switches there, so as if you could sort of, turn down the whole show. And since so much of this particular installation tended to be about scale, things either getting bigger or getting smaller, I remember having a discussion with one of the people who works at the gallery, and I was thinking of putting some flip switches there instead of dimmer switches. And I said, I don't know, what do you think, Bruce? Should I put a dimmer switch or a flip switch? And he said, well, since it's about big or little, I think you need to put a dimmer switch. And I hadn't even thought of it at that point, but I thought it was brilliant of him to come up with that. Anyway, that connects to rubber wiring that goes all the way around the gallery, along the baseboard of one wall, along the baseboard of the back wall, up over the window, where it turns black, back down again, and along the baseboard of the other side of the room, and ends in a tangle of wires, which I'll show you, right by the door, which is the door you both come in from and go out of. So in other words, the whole room is wrapped around with this wire. Also, on the base, in the middle of the space, is one of those pieces of scrap rubber, enlarged, and coming off it is a cage light bulb, the kind that you find on industrial building sites, with its own wiring, which comes off the pedestal and goes off in various tributaries, and it sort of plugs into fake rubber outlets at various points along the wall too. So the whole thing is sort of attached at one place or another. And as you move into the space, these are the views. There are the two sweat gland paintings, the dimmer switches. And then the first of the larger skin pieces. And I don't know that I have a better slide of this, but I'll have to describe it to you. Right above that larger skin painting is a white rubber spotlight, just like these up here. Just, in fact, cast from something exactly like that. I mean, of course they don't work. They're rubber, and they're not connected. But that was my sort of way of, again, acknowledging the sense of sort of the preciousness of this white cube and its own kind of slightly out-of-date quality. Just as these lights are slightly, a couple decades out of date. And also, you know, about the conventions of exhibition. How do you know you're in a gallery? Because there's spotlights and there are white walls. So I wanted to put those in. So most of the larger skin pieces here and for quite some time after the show are accompanied by these rubber spotlights. But here's a better view of that piece. It's a little bit out of focus. That's great. This is a cross-section of skin. It's hung upside down deliberately because I was so ignorant after I made it, I forgot which way was up. And I put the hanging device this way, and so it's permanently upside down. So if any of you know what cross-section of the skin looks like and you're thinking it's upside down, you're right. Where are we looking at that again? We're walking around the gallery, moving towards the back now. In the rear corner are two more skin pieces with their rubber lights. On the left is this one, which is an image of a single skin cell. This white rubber light. On the right is something I just called big skin, because it was up to that point the largest skin piece I've made. But there is a bigger one, as I'll show you. Then sort of going to the other side of the room, you meet these pieces, which are the smallest pieces in the show. The lights are smaller, but the pieces, these sort of frames are quite small. And in the center, the insets are literally impressions of my thumb. These are called true scale, two thumbs true scale. And they're called true scale because up to this point, everything in the show has been an enlargement, either an enlargement of a piece of skin or an enlargement of a scrap of rubber. And in some ways, the thumbs are really the only true scale in the sense of, you know, real scale. And also, at this point, I realized that, again, I realized this afterwards, this notion of labor or toil and sweat had sort of crept in as this very subtext, because the show opens with sweat glands, and here we have the thumb, which is, we know, is the sculptor's best tool. When you're mom with clay, this is what you do constantly. And if you don't think it's work, you should see the cysts and arthritic bumps I have on my thumb. And also, you know, the story is that it's the opposable thumb that makes us tool-wielding animals. So something like that is sort of happening on some, as I say, very hidden level, at any rate. From very small to the very big, this was the biggest skin piece I've ever made. And I'll give you a close-up view of it. It's 6 feet by 10 feet. So it's the scale of those big abstract expressionist paintings in the 50s and 60s. And I wanted to do that for the same reason that they wanted to do that, which is that, you know, they always said that their scale, that they made their paintings so big because they wanted people's bodies to be in the paintings. And I wanted people to be in the skin. I wanted people to be able to go up and actually have the skin be, all around, so much bigger than they were. And of course, I was thinking about Gulliver, not in the land of Lilliput, but in the land of the Brobdingnagians, where he's tiny and everybody else is huge. And the one episode in particular where he's picked up by the queen or the queen's nursemaid and sort of snuggled in her breast, and he nearly vomits from nausea, because of course it's so ugly to see it that large. And all the pores and pimples are right bigger than he is. And this is literally a kind of landscape of skin, also in the sense of topography, because it's made up from different images of skin. That is, I took like 3 or 4 microscopic views of skin conditions and modeled them in clay as a kind of landscape. And the piece is called, I think, Friable Epidermis with Nodules and Fissures. And it has its rubber light. And this piece, through no fault of mine, except stupidity, which means you're not at fault, right? You're just ignorant. Weighs 500 pounds, because rubber is incredibly heavy. So I won't do that again. And there's another small skin painting on the wall, more of the same, and more sort of scraps enlarged, one of which you've seen before, the one on the floor you saw in the former installation. The one on the pedestal was another little scrap of rubber that I enlarged. Here's, I think, a close-up view of those. More electrical devices behind them. And we're coming at this point, here's a close-up view, to the end of this exhibition. Making our way back out. There's the door. And as you can see, the wiring systems now are all starting to converge on this one wall right near the door. And here it is. So all the wiring comes into these white and fuse boxes with their black and white wires. And all the fuse boxes connect to this white motor on the floor. Now, I know this is hard to see, so you might have to just sort of take my word for it. But what you're looking at on the floor is a white rubber cast of a little kind of motor. Literally, it's a suction machine. It's an old-fashioned dentist's suction machine. Before they had those things they put right in your mouth, they had these things with 2 bottles with liquid and a kind of suction pump that would suck the water and the saliva out of your mouth. So everything sort of hooks into that, and that hooks into, and you really have to take my word for this, a little white table, and I can see a little miniature table on the floor there. And on the table is the original scrap of rubber, which was the model for the big abstract thing that's in the middle of the room. So in a sense, what I wanted was for the whole show to be sort of sucked back in this original little fragment out of which it grew in the first place. And it's another way in which scale, the sense of enlargement and shrinking, was sort of important to me at this point. And that was that installation. We need the other parasite. I don't have too many more slides to show you. I won't keep you too long. Just a few pieces left of some installations. I've shown Boston, the Institute of Contemporary Art, a show called Gothic. I don't think of myself as Gothic, but I also, I did think of myself as a blues singer until I heard that I had a soprano voice, so I'm not the best judge of what I am. But anyway, they let me sort of do a site-specific piece, and so I was able to do a wire piece that started at the top floor and went 3 stories down to their basement through a kind of airway or air shaft, which was surrounded, was wrapped by the staircase. So what you're looking at is sort of the main thrust of the piece. As it starts at the top of the building, it goes down this column, which goes all the way down to the basement. But before it does that, sort of at the top here, this is a bad slide, but you can see there's a white rubber emergency exit thing again, up off on the right, and it connects to a white rubber spotlight, and under the white rubber spotlight is a white rubber frame. Inside the white rubber frame is an image of my studio ceiling, and the painting is labeled literally in, again, raised relief letters, ceiling. So that's the white piece. And off from the white lamp down to the side there comes this white wire and a little one of those letters. And this letter is uncharacteristically quite euphoric and optimistic. the emotional ups and downs of a day in the studio. And this one starts out quite well. That is, if you're starting at the top story. It starts out quite well, and so the letter, or the little note, is extremely optimistic. It's even, you know, euphoric. It's the way you feel after you've had your first cup of coffee in the morning and you think anything is possible. But it isn't long before things start to go a little bit bad. I don't remember what it says, but it's enthusiastic. This is the first landing going down, and the letter here is more cautious, and everything is turned obviously quite black. But still, it's not so bad. And then working your way down, wires go up and down, and they end up here. This is the basement level. They end up in this tangle of wires, and this letter is really in a bad mood. And you turn the corner, and the wiring continues here. It goes over a doorway, travels a little distance, and the whole piece ends with this. And you'll recognize some of these elements. Another black spotlight, a black painting of, guess what, the studio floor. A note which is basically just give it up, you know, forget it. Throw up your hands in despair. And it's all connected again to this black suction pump. And that's connected to a miniature version of those cage light bulbs that you find on building sites. You can't quite see it in this slide. That's what that little lump is at the end. So the day ends rather badly. Or if you start in the basement and work your way up, it ends quite well. It depends on how you feel it. So that was that installation. Here's a close-up of that. It says floor on the rubber floor painting. And then just recently in California, last month in February, that was not last month, 2 months ago, I did an installation, and you'll see many of these same elements, just slightly rearranged. The ceiling painting, the exit sign. This was as you come into the gallery before you actually get into the first of 2 exhibition rooms. Once you get into the room, this was the installation. And again, you see familiar things. Maybe you remember the work table and the sort of biowork that was on it in the ICA space with the fluorescent light above it. Now there are 4 of them. And they're attached to 4 cast rubber gas meters up on the wall above them. And all the wiring connects both to the tables, which have these rubber switches on them, and to outlets and things on the floor. And all the wires then form a sort of river and hook up to these cast rubber computer keyboards and miniature rubber computer terminals. And then the wiring, the river of wires sort of goes off into another room. That's one tributary stream. Goes off to the left into that black suction pump that you've seen before, which I can actually show you. It goes off to the left there, plugs into that fake rubber outlet. And there's the floor painting again. But to go back to these, this piece is called Studio Strip Bare Production. And as I said, the installation consisted of 2 rooms. And in this room, I was interested in the notion of production. And again, at this point, was very aware of this text about labor and sweat and this kind of, again, at this point, probably archaic notion of physical bodily labor, and certainly in the making of art. And also notions of multiplicity and assembly line. Casting has always been about multiplicity, and that's a whole other topic. Challenges notions of originality. So all those things sort of hooking up to more modern technology. And then all of that hooking up eventually in the second room. Oh, I'm sorry. I've gotten ahead of myself. In the room with the tables and all the fluorescent lights and wiring that I just showed you, at one end, at the other end is a pedestal on which there are these miniatures. And these are miniature easels, miniature sculpture stands, and a miniature replica of the chair I have studio, which you can't see too well on the slide, miniature frames. On the sculpture stands are, well, on the little miniature dolly in the forefront is an original scrap, one of those original scraps that I pick up off the floor, this time in styrofoam. On the sculpture stand in the middle is a wax replica of one of the pieces. That is, instead of enlarging it in clay, I just took one of the original scraps, made a mold, and cast it wax, so it's exactly the same size as the original scrap. On the floor is a wax replica of a maquette of a larger piece that I made. On the sculpture stand to the left is a slight enlargement of an original plaster scrap, which is in the photograph behind it, and which was the model for the larger rubber piece that you saw in the ICA. I don't know if you recognize that sort of two padded thing. I don't know how to describe it. So this, in a way, was in the studio shrunken, and one strand of the river of wires plugged into a rubber outlet at the base of the base. So the base was connected to this too. So you have this sort of huge production system, on the one hand going off to the suction machine, on the other hand going off to this miniaturized version of the studio, and then the third sort of major tributary going into the second room, where it literally just plugs into a fake outlet on the wall. And another part of it goes off into one of those cage light bulbs. In the second room were more of these skin paintings, all of them this time images of the hand. So obviously I was quite maybe too obviously interested in juxtaposing computerization versus hand and production by hand versus machine, all of these things. But at any rate, one of them is just collagen again, the biggest one, which is here on the left, which I have close above. This is called more collagen. And here's the close-up. This one is literally the image of the skin between your thumb and your forefinger. I think it's called Between the Principle of Ego, Thumb, and the Principle of Power Index. Because I guess that's how palmistry looks at your thumb and your indexes. Ego and power. This is called flexure lines of the heart, head, and mind. And these are the lines in the palm of your hand. This is called Big Palm, and it's literally a copy of my hand slightly balled up like this. It's like this part. And this is called highly magnified fingertip skin, and that's exactly what it is. It's the magnification of the skin of the fingertip, not mine. That was the second room. Then you came out into a corridor, and in the corridor were more of the photographs that I showed you before in the studio, which I continue to take. Only this time I printed them so they were like 1 inch by 1.5 inch. So it was like looking through a keyhole. Because again, I guess I was still interested at this point in this notion of scale. And so they ran along one wall of the hallway, and opposite them was a scale model of the space. And this is, so you're looking inside a balsa wood scale model of the space that I showed the work in. So again, I wanted some sense that everything had sort of shrunk into this tiny version of itself, shrunken head of itself. And that, I think, is the end of that show. So just a couple slides left. More of the same, basically. Just highly magnified fingertip skin again with its rubber light. This is from a show called Rubber. And I know that it seems like rubber is an odd material to use, but it's actually become quite commonplace, so much so that when this curator in Europe put together this show called Rubber, which involved many people, she was inundated with calls from artists who use rubber. So just to sort of put your mind at rest about that, it's not so esoteric as it seems. But these are pieces made for the show called Rubber. And these two things were on the wall. And then at right angles to it on the wall started this wire piece, which you followed around. And again, it was the usual sort of thing, collection of wires and a computer keyboard.